Hello and welcome to our lectures on Culture for Intermediate ICCE. This is lecture 4, Change, a Postmodern Culture. First of all, we're going to look at some words and phrases that we need to understand. So, first off, postmodernism. It's a late 20th century style and concept in the arts, architecture and criticism which represents a departure from modernism, and it is characterized by the self-conscious use of earlier styles and conventions, a mixing of different artistic styles and media, and a general distrust of theories. And of course, because we're talking about culture, we're concentrating on that fact. It's a general distrust of theories. Next one up are Millennials. They're also known as Generation Y. It's a generation cohort born between the years of 1980 to the year 2000. There are around 16.2 million millennials in the UK. In 2015, millennials overtook the baby boomers in population. That's according to statistics in 2016. Our third one up is baby boomer. That's a person who was born in the years following the Second World War, when there was a temporary marked increase in the birth rate. Healthcare costs are expected to soar as baby boomers become senior citizens. And next up is Generation X. This was the generation that was born after the baby boomers, roughly from the early 1960s to the late 1970s. They're a group of people who are typically perceived to be dissatisfied and directionless. Generation X has grown up with IT, information technology. And then there's Generation Z. That group of people is also known as post-millennials. Researchers typically use a starting birth year that ranged from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. A significant aspect of this generation is the widespread use of the internet as from a young age, and if you're in that Generation Z, probably you're using a computer or something from the age of about 3. Members of Generation Z are typically thought of as being comfortable with technology and interacting on social media websites for a significant portion of their socializing. Some commentators have suggested that growing up through the Great Recession has given this cohort, this group of people, a feeling of unsettlement and insecurity. And here's another phrase that people talking about culture often use, quite a funny one really, and that is it's not a group of people, or in other words, it's not an age group, but they're referred to as helicopter parents, and that's a parent who takes an overprotective or excessive interest in the life of their child or children. Some college officials see all this as the behaviour of an overindulging generation, raised by helicopter parents and lacking in resilience. So a typical helicopter parent would be the sort that goes to the university because their child is studying and tells the professor off because the child's or student's marks aren't good enough and it's the professor's fault. Now, we've said it many times, but let's say it again. Culture is not static. It is constantly changing, though sometimes we're not even aware of the fact that it is changing because the change is slow and imperceptible. The thing is about culture is that it is almost becoming generic. It isn't generic, but it's almost becoming generic because we are on a worldwide basis subject to world pressures on local culture. It's what's called the global village effect. In the micro, and we've said this before, but in the micro you only have to go to your neighbours to experience cultural change. Even if they come from the same ethnic background, live very similar to you, there'll be differences in the things that they do, differences the way that they lay the table or don't lay the table, the kind of food that they eat. Small differences, but there is a cultural change. We need to understand the dominant culture, and we need to understand why is it important to understand the dominant culture. To do so, we need to understand where you have been. Where have I been? Where are you now? Why are you here? Where are you needed to be? And to understand all of those things, how did you get there? And where are you now? You see, the fact of the matter is that history has, in all sorts of ways, moulded us, and we can't ignore the fact that history has brought us to this point, and our culture is part of what history has produced. And we need to understand ourselves and why we're here and what's going on. I want us to try and have a look at some of the major current effects on culture, and particularly our culture in the United Kingdom. I have said that this generation could be called the Fatherless Generation, and this is affecting families and so-called culture. Now, it varies from country to country. In some countries it's due to the breakup of families, i.e. divorce, infidelity and a loss of stability, and that loss of stability and divorce puts pressure on communities and individuals, and it puts a pressure on the culture as a whole. In some countries it's due to war and loss by death, so that again puts a huge pressure on the community and the individual, and again it puts pressure on the culture as a whole. In some countries it's due to the AIDS epidemic leading to loss of parents, and again it puts pressure on the community, pressure on the individuals, and pressure on the culture as a whole. Many today are asking questions that are culturally related, including government. The loss of family stability worldwide has huge implications on our culture, and from a government point of view it affects economics and taxes. One of the things that is constantly talked about in the United Kingdom is the shortage of housing, and oftentimes refugees and immigrants and of late people from the European Union are blamed for a housing shortage. However, all of those things I'm sure have effects on housing, but how about the fact that isn't talked about, that every time you have a divorce you seem to need two houses or 2 points of accommodation? It's fairly obvious and fairly common sense, but nobody talks about it. There are various causes of family loss, and again I've said that depends where in the world you are. However, the end product is the same: huge pressure on culture as a whole. It would be good to think about and ask the question, what is the greatest cause of family breakup here in the United Kingdom? And what effect has family breakup had on the community at large? What are the major changes brought about by this pressure on family, and change on the culture? What are they? What is happening? Again, many are asking, and this includes government as well, why are there so many school exclusions? Why is there hooliganism? What is the cause and effect? Why is there so much weekend drunkenness in our culture? And what has caused the fractures and breakdowns on our current culture? Some people will say, well, it isn't breaking down, there isn't fractures. I think I would beg to differ, and I think that there are many fractures. In terms of children coming into the care system, if you look at statistics, they are going up every year. What I mean by that is the amount of young children coming into the care system is increasing year on year. That is putting huge pressure on our culture. Under pressure, the family. Is the family under pressure? Well, I think it is. And again, government is concerned, and rightly so. The question needs to be asked, but what has caused the pressure? Is the pressure increasing? Is there more pressure on families? If so, why and what are those pressures? Some would say, well, that's the way it is. But why is it like that? Is the family under pressure? And I'm telling you, if it is, then the rest of the culture is also under pressure. What we live in today is what is called a postmodern culture. Now, many would perhaps argue on that, because we've talked earlier on in this lecture today on some of the things that are changing, like Generation X, Generation Y and Generation Z. So there are changes going on, but I would argue that we are still in a postmodern cultural situation. There are other things that we probably could look at. I want us to look at some nice new words. First of all, the word meta-narrative. It probably represents the biggest ever change in our culture. And most of you hold a meta-narrative view, even if you don't know what a meta-narrative is. And that worldview will determine your action and how you live your life, and will of course affect the moulding of your personal culture, and that of course feeds into the community at large. But what is a meta-narrative? Well, the easy way to describe that word is it's the big picture. In other words, if you have a meta-narrative worldview, you will see a beginning of something, a middle and an end. It's going somewhere. Current culture, postmodernism, doesn't have a meta-narrative, and therefore, because it doesn't have a meta-narrative, it doesn't have what we call absolutes. And I think absolutes are very important. Actually, it does have one, but like most of us, we don't think about it or acknowledge that it's there. Somebody said something very interesting. I wish I'd have said it, but I didn't. It was that the last group of teens or teenagers able to rebel were born in the 60s. Why would we say that? I probably should finish off that last slide and say why we think that the last teenagers able to rebel were born in the 60s. And the reality is that the 60s they were rebelling and shouting peace and love. It's the age of the sexual revolution. But in reality, if you sweep away all rules and all absolutes, there is nothing to rebel against. So what are you going to rebel against? And if you listen carefully to people talking today, they don't talk about sin or wrong, they talk about unacceptable behaviour. In other words, we've done away with some of those important words. Anyway, let's move on. An update on cultural perspectives. Millennials grew up in an electronic filled and increasingly online and socially networked world. They are the generation, and if you're part of that generation, you're the generation that has received the most marketing attention. And actually, you're probably the most ethnically diverse generation. Millennials tend to be tolerant of differences. Millennials have been raised under the mantra of follow your dreams, and they're used to being told that they were special. Millennials tend to be confident. While largely that's a positive trait, the millennial generation confidence has been argued can spill over into the realms of entitlement and narcissism. they are slightly more optimistic about the future than other generations. Millennials are expected to be the first generation that is less economically successful than their parents, and the parents would be the silent generation. We haven't used that phrase up till now, have we? The silent generation are those people that were probably born in the war years or pre-war, so that generation that were in the Second World War, they would be called the silent generation. Usually they just got on with it and didn't make a fuss to government. They weren't a protesting generation. They weren't part of the 60s sexual revolution, and so they're often referred to as the silent generation. One report results of millennial optimism is entering into adulthood with unrealistic expectations, which sometimes leads to disillusionment. Many early millennials went through post-secondary education only to find themselves employed in unrelated fields or underemployed and job hopping more frequently than previous generations. Their expectations may have resulted from the very encouraging, involved and almost ever-present group of parents that became known as those helicopter parents. In my years, and I don't know quite where I fit, but I was certainly around in the 60s, but when I left school, I lived in the Midlands and of the United Kingdom, and leaving school there were at that time 12 jobs for every 10 school leavers. That certainly has changed today, hasn't it? Here's some interesting statistics about the millennials. 50% of millennials consider themselves politically unaffiliated. 29% consider themselves religiously unaffiliated. Millennials have the highest average number of Facebook friends, with an average of 250 friends versus Generation X's 200. 55% have posted a selfie or more to a social media site there versus 20% of Generation X. 8% of millennials claim to have sex texted, whereas 30% claim to have received sex texts. Worrying factors. Some more interesting statistics about millennials. They send a median of 50 texts per day. As of 2012, only 19% of millennials said that generally other people could be trusted. There are about 76 million millennials in the United States based on research using the years 1978 to 2000. Millennials are the last generation born in the 20th century. 20% have at least one immigrant parent. That would be statistics for the USA, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's very similar to the UK. Okay, back to postmodernism. In the UK, I broadly define us as a postmodern culture, and this culture works in a different way, a very different way to modern culture. Modern culture assumes a meta-narrative. Modern culture assumes a cause and effect. Modern culture assumes a logical order. Modern culture assumes there is a big picture and there is a big story. Our culture today, postmodernism, no longer makes those assumptions and it works more like this. So let's look at the postmodern generation and Generation X and Y and look at some of the positives and the negatives. There are positives of postmodernism, but there are also negatives too. But the positive side is that the postmodernist loves stories. The negative side of that is that the stories are disconnected because they don't have a meta-narrative. The positive side is that they desire spirituality. The negative side of that is that spirituality of postmodernism is pick and mix, a bit like those sweets you see in the cinema, and you put them all in a bag and you take a few of these and a few of that, so you choose the ones that you like the best. The positive is that this generation is not materialistic. The negative side of that, it's not strongly enough materialistic. The positive side is that the postmoderns believe in justice. The negative side of that is that that justice tends to be movable and can change from day to day. The positive side is that postmoderns have respect for the individual. The negative side is that the individual is not everything. The positive side is that postmoderns live in the present. The present is everything. But actually, the trouble with that is, and the negative side is, that the present is disconnected from the big story. I've always said that if you are a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or any kind of religion for that matter, you will believe in a meta-narrative. Big stories, meta-narrative, worldviews matter. Why do they matter? Because there is no neutrality. Every aspect of life and work is actually embedded in a big story. And in reality, even those who claim to be non-religious, agnostic or atheist, they still live in a big story and try to create one. So, in the postmodern thinking, if there is no meta-narrative, but they're creating one, what is the big story? And actually, the big story is the secular big story. And what is the secular big story? Well, it's materialism. It's materialism that matters. That's the big story. Materialism, the material world, is all that there is. And number two, enjoying materialism is all that matters. Material world is all that there is. Enjoying it is all that matters. If you think about it, materialism is that it all came out of nothing and it eventually equals nothing. Richard Letwin is a famous evolutionary geneticist from Harvard University, and this is what he said, and I quote, "It is not the methods and institution of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for this phenomenal world, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." All big stories, all meta-narratives have consequences for good or ill, for individuals, for communities, and for the wider society. The secular big story carries particular risks of harm and conflict for everyone. Maybe you don't know who Eric Harris is. Well, Eric Harris was a student at Columbine High School, and on the 20th of April 1999 he shot 12 of his fellow students dead and a teacher in Colorado, USA. And they discovered his diary, and in his diary he had written this: "There is no such thing as true good or true evil. It's all relative to the observer. It's just all nature, chemistry and maths. Deal with it." So, does it matter? Does our meta-narrative, the big story, have an effect on our culture? Does it really matter? What way could the media, education, thinking affect our actions and life? And should we care? Again, does it really matter? Richard Peters was a major educationalist, and he lived between 1919 and he died in 2011. And he said this: "Our basic predicament in life is to learn to live with its ultimate pointlessness. We are monotonously reminded that education must be for life. So obviously the most important dimensions of education is that in which we learn to come to terms with the pointlessness of life." Does that help us to explain, Eric? Well, we're drawing to the end of this lecture. I've posed lots and lots of difficult questions, haven't I, in this one? I hope that as we continue the course we will come to some sound answers, but that's it for today, apart from I'm about to tell you what the homework is. Not really homework, but your test for section 4. This is the assignment. I want you to watch the film Wadaja. I don't know even how to say that because it is a hard word, but it's an interesting film. The film is in Arabic with English subtitles, and you're going to be looking at a very, very different culture. And I would like you to write 500 words on what the culture does, the culture that you're looking at on the film, what it does to women, to children, to men, and what you think about the cultural moulders of that culture. I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture.